Previously, on the last days of World War II, in the Pacific, after 3 months of brutal fighting on Okinawa, the US finally claimed victory. In the United States, the Joint Chiefs of Staff discussed plans for the invasion of mainland Japan. And General Dwight D. Eisenhower was given a hero's welcome home on the streets of New York City. This week, in the Pacific, US troops begin the process of mopping up on Okinawa and rounding up Japanese POWs. In Moscow, the Soviet Union celebrates victory over Germany with an elaborate parade. And in the United States, President Truman weighs his options for ending the war against Japan. He approves plans for a mainland invasion, but keeps close watch on the top-secret development of the world's first atomic bomb. June the 24th, Okinawa. After 82 days, Operation Iceberg, the campaign to seize Okinawa, is all but over. The Pacific island is now under the control of US forces. American troops begin mopping up operations and prepare facilities for the impending invasion of the Japanese mainland. Japanese prisoners are moved into tented camps, while US officials determine their fate. Above their heads, B-24 Liberators buzz over the island's interior, scattering leaflets urging other survivors, still in hiding, to surrender. US troops fluent in Japanese also announce the end of the battle using loudspeakers mounted on tanks. They attempt to lure survivors out of their hiding places with the promise of food and water. But many Japanese still refuse to accept defeat. Along the shoreline, patrolling US ships pick up swimmers trying to evade capture. Others would remain hidden in the island's forested bastions for weeks to come. June the 25th. As the smoke clears, the devastation resulting from the bloody campaign becomes apparent. The island's infrastructure has been obliterated. Towns and villages lie in ruins. Ancient buildings of great architectural and religious significance have been destroyed by air raids and artillery fire.
By the end of the campaign, a third of the Okinawan civilian population is dead. Most of the historical monuments, most of the historical landscape in Okinawa has been obliterated. Okinawan families link their heritage to family tombs, many of which had been turned into fortifications by the Japanese troops, most of which were then destroyed by the Americans.
Peasant farmers have lost their homes, crops, and livestock. The Imperial Command had instilled an intense fear of American troops within the Japanese population. Entire families willingly lunge off cliffs rather than be taken by American troops.
The native population had been told that we would slaughter, rape, kill, pillage, torture, that we would do terrible things to them, and women with babies in their arms jumped over the cliff. We had a very difficult time being able to try and convince them that we weren't going to harm them.
As American ground troops begin to try and restore order on Okinawa, US bombers continue to unleash a relentless wave of destruction over the Japanese heartland. Tokyo is in ruins.
It was just burned out. It was barren. Concrete buildings still standing, but burned out completely inside and just completely devastated.
But the determination of the Japanese Supreme War Council to fight to the death remains steadfast. June the 26th, more than 500 B-29s bombard targets in mainland Japan. The raids devastate armaments factories on Honshu, including the Kawasaki and Mitsubishi aircraft factories, and the Osaka and Nagoya arsenals. The terrifying attacks are part of daily life for Japanese city dwellers. Thousands have been killed or injured. Millions more are homeless and starving. Essential services have ground to a halt. June the 29th, 3 days later, Bomber Commander General Curtis LeMay estimates that the entire country can be completely annihilated by October the 1st, just 3 months away. The Japanese government will still not surrender. They continue to spread propaganda throughout the populace, extolling the invincibility of Japanese troops. But they also realize that with the fall of Okinawa, 900 miles south of Tokyo, an American ground invasion looms. Japan's Supreme War Council devises a plan to defend the homeland. Special attention is paid to Tokyo and the revered Japanese Emperor Hirohito. A provisional palace is planned on the outskirts of Nagano City, as construction begins of an underground imperial headquarters in the mountains of Matsushiro. The council decides that in the event of a US invasion, Japan will be defended by all available means. They plan long-range assaults by submarines and bombers on Allied island bases. If invading fleets manage to close within 200 miles of the mainland, they are to be met with long-range artillery fire and, rising up from the horizon, a cloud of kamikaze aircraft.
The Japanese had by no means eliminated their supply of planes. They weren't top-of-the-line planes. A lot of these were been poorly maintained. They weren't the best that the Japanese had to offer. But American estimates are that there are several thousand, maybe as many as 6,000 or 7,000 planes being held in reserve by the Japanese military for the defense of the main islands itself. They would go after the naval vessels. They would be used against the landing craft. There are a variety of different methods that the special assault units could use to defend against the assault, or to be used once the assault had begun on the main islands.
On land, the Japanese have 2.3 million troops under arms. Despite the vast firepower available to the Allies, the landings are expected to constitute some of the toughest and bloodiest fighting of the war. If the Allies get off the beachheads, the entire population of Japan is being organized to fight as a vast guerrilla army.
They had assembled hundreds of thousands of troops in Kyushu, where they expected the landing to be. The idea was simply to throw human bombs, in a sense, at the American invaders and inflict such heavy losses on the American invading forces that, again, the Americans would say, well, enough is enough, and we'll negotiate. It was expected to make the Americans again cry uncle. This was the whole point.
As the Imperial Command prepares to defend mainland Japan at all costs, the last surviving Japanese troops on the Philippines now face death or defeat. After a 5-month campaign, General Douglas MacArthur is determined to weed out the last pockets of resistance. But despite the grim outlook, Japanese General Yamashita is just as determined to maintain resistance. June the 28th, Luzon. General MacArthur declares the battle for Luzon is over. His announcement is welcome news on the home front, but it is, however, premature. The enemy has not yet given up. Thousands of Japanese troops are still at large. General Yamashita and what remains of his army are holed up in mountainous terrain. They will be engaged by US forces and Filipino guerrillas for weeks to come. June the 30th, Mindanao. 2 days after MacArthur declares victory on Luzon, General Eichelberger, commanding the US 8th Army, reports that the last pockets of resistance have been wiped out. Some pockets, in fact, remain, but Mindanao is under effective US control. 820 American troops have been killed securing the island, but the Japanese defenders have been slaughtered. 10,000 Japanese troops have been killed. 8,000 more die of starvation or disease. 22,000 survive the jungle and surrender at the war's end. Mopping up in the dense jungle of Mindanao will continue for weeks. The US 6th Army in Luzon is now ordered to prepare for the invasion of Japan. June the 24th, 3 RAF squadrons set off for the River Kwai in Thailand. Their target, 2 strategically important railway bridges. Both had been built with the blood and back-breaking labor of Allied POWs held by the Japanese.
At each end of both bridges there was a gun pit with heavy machine guns, and these would be firing at the attacking planes, but the air gunners in the planes would be retaliating. So you attack the bridge at an angle of, say, 2-3 degrees across it, so that at least perhaps one of your stick of bombs would make a direct hit, and the rest, of course, would rock the foundations.
The bridges, built 2 years earlier, served as vital Japanese supply lines. Supplies and ammunition cross over them daily, destined for Japanese troops in Burma. Several previous attempts by the US Army Air Force to destroy the bridges had failed. The RAF is now determined to knock out this supply route once and for all. The bridges are hit and destroyed. Witnessing their demolition is bittersweet for those who built them.
We saw the planes coming over and we saw the puffs of smoke and the explosions, and we were cheering, you know, in our way. We daren't be too euphoric because the Japs were going berserk. Can you believe it? I had mixed feelings. I thought, damn me, it took us 9 months to build this blessed bridge, and they're going to knock it down in a couple of seconds.
The bridges are gone, but it would be some time before the POWs who built them would taste freedom. As the British advance through Burma, the Japanese relocate the remaining prisoners. The bombing of the Burma-Thailand Railroad is just one more setback for the Japanese in Southeast Asia. They are also hit hard on Borneo as the Allies launch a series of air and sea strikes. June the 24th, Borneo. Allied bombers pound Japanese positions, dropping more than 1,000 tons of high explosives. June the 26th. 2 days later, under the command of US Admiral Daniel Barbie, an Allied naval force of 9 cruisers and 13 destroyers mounts a massive assault on Borneo's eastern city of Balikpapan, an important seaport and oil center. The bombardment continues for 3 days. 3,000 tons of bombs and nearly 40,000 artillery shells rain down on the city, paving the way for a landing by Australian ground forces. The Allies are gaining momentum in the Pacific and on the offensive on all fronts. In Europe, the fighting is over. But the victorious Allies now face the grueling process of rebuilding the shattered continent. Following years of bloodshed and battle, driving rain is not enough to douse the euphoria of Russians who've taken to the streets to celebrate victory over Germany. June the 24th, Moscow. In keeping with Russian tradition, conquering hero Marshal Zhukov makes his entrance into Red Square on the back of a white Tersky stallion. To the beat of drums, 200 Red Army troops follow, carrying captured flags of the fallen Third Reich. They march to the foot of Lenin's tomb and throw the rain-soaked Nazi flags to the ground. Stalin looks on from a distance. For the moment, the Soviet dictator allows his most successful battlefield commander to take center stage.
I can still see it. It was a summer day. It was raining. Red Square was decorated with banners. People were wearing medals, and you could see these medals shining all over Red Square. The Kremlin clock chimed, and Georgy Zhukov rode in on a white horse. 3 times hero of the Soviet Union. He looked proud, sturdy, upright. He sat in the saddle like a young lieutenant. When Stalin saw this great commander on his white horse, he felt jealous. Stalin didn't want Zhukov to overshadow his glory. And being suspicious, Stalin couldn't cope with it.
Well aware of Zhukov's popularity amongst Russians, Stalin's restraint is calculated. He has every intention of keeping Zhukov under his thumb. The Soviet marshal addresses the jubilant crowd and warns that although the Red Army is the most powerful in the world, there is no room for complacency. The Soviet Union rejoices in the victory of communism and the defeat of fascism. June the 29th. Following the victory parade, Stalin assumes the title of Generalissimo. The Soviet leader is decorated for his outstanding service in the Great Patriotic War and awarded the highest Soviet military decoration, the Order of Victory, set with 110 diamonds. Stalin, whose army purges and strategic interventions nearly lost the war in 1941, now takes the plaudits. He is at the height of his power. Meanwhile, the Western Allies grow anxious at his vice-like grip on Berlin.
The Iron Curtain did come down incredibly swiftly after the formal end of the war. That the Soviets made absolutely plain that they didn't want any Western soldiers of any kind anywhere near their people. And just as they'd said all along to their people, there was to be absolutely no fraternization with American or British troops.
Stalin continues to keep the Western Allies at bay, arguing that Berlin is full of mines and his troops need more time to clear them. The Soviet leader is intent on claiming what's left of Berlin's infrastructure and setting up a local puppet government, which he can bend entirely to his will.
They began to dismantle what machinery was left and ship it back to the Soviet Union. So you had a really paradoxical situation. Unlike the Americans and the British, the Russians already had a German communist government all set up. And they were immediately installed as the new liberation government. But this government had a lot of trouble because the Russians were busy taking everything that moved and sending it back to the Soviet Union, and actually simply raping women as an act of real revenge. We don't know how many, but we're talking about hundreds of thousands of rapes.
June the 29th. Allied representatives meet with Marshal Zhukov in Berlin to determine exactly when they will be given access to the city. Zhukov skirts the issue. He knows that Stalin wants to retain control of the German capital for as long as possible.
I think he wanted to keep his options open, control that part of Germany that the Red Army occupied, to control it completely. I don't think there's any doubt that in the long run, Stalin wanted to have a communist Germany.
The Western Allies are impatient and suspicious, but it will be days before they gain access to Berlin. June the 24th, Berlin. Inside the city, German citizens are exhausted and starving. Following their rampage of plundering and rape, the conquering Red Army begins distributing much-needed food and water. As citizens across Germany cope with defeat for the second time in less than 30 years, the Allies continue to round up Nazi officials seeking to evade justice. Those that have been captured are quick to deny responsibility for the horrific list of war crimes. Hitler's successor, Admiral Karl Dönitz, refuses to accept accountability for what has been done in the name of the Third Reich.
When Dönitz says to the investigators after the war that he had no idea about this, that's simply not true. It's impossible not to know. The son of Dönitz's predecessor, Admiral Tirpitz, who was the great admiral of the First World War, and he had a son who was in the Navy called Wolfgang von Tirpitz, and I knew him very, very well. And he once said to me at 2 o'clock in the morning when we had these long talks, he says, anybody from my social class who tells you they did not know what was going on is lying.
As the hunt for war criminals continues, both the Western Allies and the Soviets are racing to get their hands on cutting-edge German technology. June the 24th, Cherbourg, France. The last of 4 German Arado 234 jet bombers, acquired by the US Army Air Force, comes into land. The aircraft are to be loaded aboard the carrier HMS Reaper, along with other advanced German aircraft, and shipped to the United States. During the last year of the war, Allied jet technology, led by the British, had produced few flying prototypes. But the Germans were already using the world's first operational jet bomber, the Arado AR-234. Named Blitz, or Lightning, by the Germans, the Arado AR-234 jet bomber made its operational debut soaring high over France in the summer of 1944. Conceived in 1941, the Arado was originally designed as a high-speed, high-altitude reconnaissance aircraft. Its first operational flight took place on August 2, 1944, when an Arado pilot photographed Allied activity on the Normandy beaches. Unbeknownst to the Allies, 2 high-speed, high-flying Arados flew a total of 13 missions over their lines in 3 weeks. With a top speed of 460 miles an hour and a ceiling of nearly 33,000 feet, the Arado could outrun any Allied aircraft, apart from the Gloster Meteor. At 30,000 feet, it was also out of range of anti-aircraft fire. Even though intended as bombers, Arados proved superb reconnaissance aircraft. By March 1945, the Germans destroyed the Arado factory to keep it out of Soviet hands. However, the jets were employed by the Luftwaffe until war's end. By then, all eyes were on the Arado. The British grabbed 12, the Soviets secured only 1. 4 of the remaining Arados were flown to France by American pilots. Today, only one Arado AR-234 is known to be still in existence at the Smithsonian Institution in Washington. As the Allies race to incorporate captured German technology, 3 years of planning and cooperation between the Allied nations is about to bear fruit in San Francisco. Delegates from 50 countries have convened to pledge their commitment to global accord. June the 26th, San Francisco. Following 9 weeks of intense negotiations, China becomes the first of 50 countries to sign the Charter of the United Nations Organization. The Charter provides that all major issues brought before the organization require a 2/3 majority vote. Emergency decisions, however, can be reached by the 11-member Security Council. 5 of the 11, the US, UK, Soviet Union, France and China, are named permanent members. The remaining 6 are to be elected in rotation every 2 years. Witnessed by President Truman, the last signature on the UN Charter is that of Edward Stettinius, US Secretary of State. Edward Stettinius, known affectionately as Little Stet, was born into a life of privilege in Chicago in 1900. The son of a partner at J.P. Morgan, Stettinius began his career at General Motors in 1926. In 1934, he joined US Steel and served as chairman of the board. Stettinius, however, resigned in May 1940 when he was asked to head up the newly formed National Defense Advisory Commission. He was later appointed US Under-Secretary of State and succeeded Cordell Hull as Secretary in December 1944. 2 months later, he accompanied President Roosevelt to the Yalta Conference in the Crimea. When Truman took over in April 1945, Stettinius retained his position. June the 26th. Following the historic signing of the UN Charter, President Truman addresses the assembled delegates, telling them that they have helped to win a victory against war itself.
The Charter of the United Nations, which you are now signing, is a solid structure upon which we can build for a better world. If we had had this charter a few years ago, and above all the will to use it, millions now dead would be alive. With this charter, the world can begin to look forward to the time when all worthy human beings may be permitted to live decently as free people.
June the 27th. The next day, Edward Stettinius resigns from Truman's cabinet to become the U.S. representative to the United Nations.
The war has left behind its inevitable aftermath of suffering and hunger and starvation, and crops have failed just when they were needed the most. We must do more, and we shall do more. To all the great problems which now and hereafter we must work out together as friends who speak frankly to one another, but who are united by the higher obligations of the United Nations Charter in the cause of man himself.
Stettinius will be succeeded as U.S. Secretary of State by James F. Burns, a former Supreme Court Justice. Following the ratification of the UN Charter in San Francisco, history is also made in Poland. June the 28th, Warsaw. In the ruins of the city, the Polish Government of National Unity is established. The leadership of post-war Poland was claimed by two rival groups, a Soviet-sponsored provisional government dominated by communists, and members of the Polish government in exile in London. After tense negotiations and Soviet promises of free elections, the Government of National Unity was formed. It is, however, decidedly pro-Soviet.
The Poles who wanted a free democracy were simply ruthlessly executed wherever they were captured. Some Poles who were serving with the Red Army began to realize that the Red Army was about to become not their liberator but their oppressor, and deserted. Well, they were all shot too. Anyone who opposed the will of the Soviet Union in Eastern Europe in early 1945 was executed ruthlessly.
Overall, where there's a Red Army, there tends to be a communist government by the end of the day.
The following week, the new government is officially recognized by Great Britain and the United States. From Burma to the Philippines, the Japanese strategic position is hopeless, but the Imperial Command will still not capitulate. The American atomic bomb program is still highly classified. Most US military planners are not even aware of its existence. Those that do have no guarantees that the bomb will be completed in time, that it will work properly, or that it will succeed in forcing Japan to surrender. The forward base for US troops is now Okinawa, roughly 900 miles south of Tokyo. The invasion of mainland Japan seems inevitable.
When Okinawa was essentially secured, we were sent back to San Francisco for our overhaul that was well overdue, but with the idea that when that was completed, we would probably get back out there in time for the invasion of Japan.
June the 29th, Washington. Truman approves an invasion plan proposed by the Joint Chiefs of Staff under the direction of General George Marshall. General George Marshall was appointed US Army Chief of Staff on September the 1st, 1939, the day Hitler invaded Poland. It was more than 2 years before the US would enter the war, but President Roosevelt knew that the US might eventually be drawn in. In anticipation of that day, he wanted a senior military official at his side who understood the challenges that lay ahead. To fulfill that role, on the recommendation of his trusted advisor Harry Hopkins and General Pershing, Roosevelt appointed Marshall. A career soldier, Marshall impressed Roosevelt with his candor and shrewd grasp of strategy. The US Chief of Staff quickly began to foster relationships with the British Chiefs of Staff. But following the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941, there were many in the US who argued that the Pacific Front ought to come first. Marshall was one ardent advocate of Rainbow 5, the code name for the US strategy of Germany first. Marshall was certain that the war in Europe should have top priority, and his viewpoint was the one finally adopted. But he was profoundly disappointed not to be chosen to lead the Allies into occupied Europe following D-Day. That job went to Eisenhower. Roosevelt considered Marshall indispensable. He remained in Washington until the end of the war. When he stepped down as Chief of Staff, he was replaced by Eisenhower. In 1947, he was appointed Secretary of State by Harry Truman, replacing James Burns.
I assume the duties with a feeling of great responsibility.
During his tenure, he established the European Recovery Programme, also known as the Marshall Plan, in which the US spent billions helping to rebuild the war-torn nations of Europe. The Marshall Plan provided humanitarian aid, whilst rebuilding markets for America and undermining the potential spread of communism westward.
To be quite clear, this unprecedented endeavor of the New World to help the old is neither sure nor easy. It is a calculated risk.
The Soviet Union was already occupying much of Eastern Europe. That was already a source of great distress to many Americans. And communist parties were emerging after the war in most of the Western European nations. And this was why the United States launched the Marshall Plan. And it's to a large degree why the United States launched the containment policy and created NATO. And did a whole range of things to try to draw these Western Europeans into the orbit of the United States and out of the reach of communism.
It is a difficult program, and you know far better than I do the political difficulties involved in this program. But there's no doubt whatever in my mind that if we decide to do this thing, we can do it successfully.
During the Korean War, Marshall was appointed Secretary of Defense. Truman had already described him as the greatest living American. He retired in 1951. 2 years later, he was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. June the 29th. It is decided that the planned invasion of Japan will be led by General Douglas MacArthur, Supreme Allied Commander of the Southwest Pacific.
MacArthur was seen as a forceful spokesman for the Army's interests, and as someone who could marshal resources, and as someone who could organize a campaign like this, and therefore would be a natural participant in taking Japan.
Codenamed Operation Olympic, the first landings are to take place on the southern island of Kyushu.
It was supposed to involve 650,000 assault troops who would land at 3 separate areas, 3 divisions apiece, and you'd have at least 2 divisions in reserve, others that you could throw in. They hoped to overrun Kyushu, which was defended by about 250,000 Japanese troops. But this would be the prelude to invading the main island.
The second landing, dubbed Operation Coronet, will be on the main island of Honshu, set for March the 1st the following year. MacArthur believes that the assault on Kyushu will require 13 divisions, Honshu 23. The 2-stage invasion will call upon as many as 5 million troops, most of them American, including the US First Army from Europe. In the light of the prolonged and bloody battle for Okinawa, the invasion of Japan is expected to be hard fought, to say the least.
They're also generating a great deal of intelligence about Japanese troop movements in Japan itself, but the relocation of troops to Kyushu, the placement of troops and planes in reserve on the main islands themselves, which also gives them some sense of what the defenses are going to be like for what the invasion might look like later that year.
A Japanese colonel had prophesied to US General Jonathan Wainwright, then a prisoner on Formosa, "You have no chance of beating Japan. There are 100 million people in the Japanese Empire. It will take 10 times 100 million to defeat Japan. It will therefore become a matter of generations."
We already knew how sincerely the Japanese followed orders. It would have been a slaughterhouse on both sides there, and everybody knew it.
As plans for the invasion of mainland Japan are finalized in Washington, a secret and untested weapon is in the advanced stages of development in the deserts of New Mexico, under the scientific direction of J. Robert Oppenheimer. This new weapon has the potential to end the war in days.
They were working on a weapon of mass destruction. But Oppenheimer gave them a sense that this had a larger function and purpose as well. And that was, as he told them when he recruited them, we'll probably be able to put an end to this war.
Everybody had great faith it was going to come about. The skepticism, if involved, as far as I could understand, was when. And the urgency of the situation made it such that everybody was pushing to make the when as short as possible.
June the 30th, the McDonald Ranch, Los Alamos, New Mexico. On land once dotted with livestock and corrals, preparations for the detonation of the world's first nuclear device are in full swing. The discovery of how to release nuclear energy had been made in Nazi Germany in 1938.
Within a week of the news of the discovery of nuclear fission, that is to say, the discovery of how to release nuclear energy, an enormous new source of energy, scientists, physicists everywhere in the world were aware that with so much energy possible, a bomb was possible. And within the next year, 1939, every major country that had the possibility of working on a bomb started a bomb program, because it was clear from the beginning that there was no defense against such a small and portable and holocaustal weapon, except to have such weapons yourself and to threaten retaliation.
Nearly 2 months after Germany's surrender, scientists recruited for the top-secret Manhattan Project continue to work with the utmost urgency. As the war in the Pacific rages on, the bomb has the potential to force Japan to surrender and prevent the horrific casualties projected in a mainland invasion.
There was a lot of anger at that point in the war. The Japanese refusal to surrender infuriated us. People were still being killed. The Japanese had no Air Force left. They had no Navy left. We had completely blockaded the home islands. Their food supply was down to about 1,000 calories a day of weeds and buckwheat hulls. And yet they wouldn't surrender long after any other, I think, nation would have said, all right, we lost. What do we do now? And that was part of the whole Japanese Bushido military tradition. But from our point of view, it was maddening.
Dubbed the Gadget, US military officials estimate that the first test of this atomic device would result in a blast of unparalleled force.
I mean, this was a very dramatic weapon. There was nothing even close to it that had ever been used during the war, even though we had 1,000-pound bombs in those days and had rained them on Germany and eventually Japan. They were nothing compared to what this would be.
It's decided that Gadget will be tested on the Alamogordo bombing and gunnery range in the empty deserts of New Mexico. 7 other sites had been considered for the test, including an army training area in the Mojave Desert, San Nicolas Island off the coast of Southern California, and Padre Island in the Gulf of Mexico. Alamogordo is chosen primarily because it offers isolation, meaning secrecy and safety.
Alamogordo is in the southernmost part of New Mexico. It is barren, lonely, there's nothing there, a wonderful place to erect a test site.
The site is just 230 miles south of Los Alamos. The valley is now called the Trinity Site. The Trinity test, the first nuclear detonation, would take place on July the 16th, a little more than 2 weeks away.
The 2 to 3 week period prior to the test showed a much greater activity in the areas of the people responsible for putting the bomb together, for assuring that each and every component pre-tested perfectly, and in the last week to pack everything up, to send it all down to the desert, rebuild it and put it up over there, bring it up on the tower, and that was it.
Final preparations for the test, including the assembly of the bomb's plutonium core, would begin on July the 12th. The world inches closer to the dawn of the atomic age. Next, on the last days of World War II, US and British troops get their first glimpse of the previously forbidden German capital, Berlin.
In Berlin, we definitely got the sense that there was a split amongst the Allies. The Russians were there, and they did not welcome us.
In Washington, Operation Overcast, a top-secret plan to snatch the best German scientists before they fall into Soviet hands, begins.
Wernher von Braun was a highly sought-after commodity. He also happened to have been a Nazi.
And in Britain, the country goes to the polls to elect a post-war government with shocking results.
Churchill, of course, was devastated by election defeat, and he felt that it was base ingratitude by the British people after all he'd done to save them.